Another round for the bar. Mr. Hayes. Patrick Hayes smiled as he reached for the whiskey bottle, the October lamplight catching on the cut glass. The Golden Bell on a Saturday night was everything he'd built it to be, polished mahogany gleaming, brass fixtures catching light, the satisfying weight of silver coins sliding across the bar. 15 years of work stood solid around him. He poured generous measures for the miners crowded 3 deep at the rail. Good men, most of them, hard workers who earned their recreation. Patrick knew their names, their claims, their families. When Tom Morrison had broken his leg last spring, Patrick had extended credit for 2 months without complaint. "You're a generous man, Mr. Hayes," raising his glass. "Not many would have carried me like you did." Patrick waved off the thanks, but the warmth settled in his chest. He employed 15 people in this town of 800 souls. His bartenders, his cook, his cleaning women, they all fed families from wages he paid. The Golden Bell wasn't just a business, it was an institution. Outside, autumn wind rattled the windows, cold coming early this year. Patrick had already ordered extra coal for the stove, making sure his place stayed warm when men needed refuge from the Wyoming weather. That was service, that was community. His head bartender, Samuel Birch, worked the far end of the bar with practiced efficiency. The piano player, a consumptive fellow from Denver, coaxed ragtime from the battered upright in the corner. 3 card games ran at tables near the stove. It was controlled chaos, profitable chaos. The kind Patrick had perfected over 15 years of careful management. He'd started with nothing, a Kentucky orphan who'd drifted west after the war, finding work where he could, saving every dollar. When Copper Ridge was just a mining camp of tents and hope, Patrick had built the first permanent structure, a rough saloon that was more shed than establishment. But it had been his. Now the Golden Bell had imported fixtures, real glass in the windows, a mahogany bar shipped from St. Louis, and upstairs, in the rooms above the saloon, Patrick kept the evidence of his greatest achievement letters from his daughter Bridget, written in the elegant hand her expensive convent school education had provided. She was 20 now, her schooling finally complete. Tomorrow she'd be home on the afternoon train. Patrick imagined her pride when she saw what he'd built, how he'd provided for her. Everything he'd done had been for her future, for the life she deserved. A fight started near the card tables, nothing serious, just a dispute over a hand. Samuel moved in smoothly, separating the men before it escalated. Patrick approved. He ran a respectable establishment. No brawling, no cheating, honest whiskey at fair prices. At midnight, he began the closing routine. The last drunk stumbled out into the October cold. Samuel and the other bartender cleaned glasses while Patrick tallied the day's receipts. $300, a good night. He locked the cash in his safe, satisfaction warming him more than the whiskey ever had. Tomorrow he'd order new glassware from Denver. The Golden Bell deserved the finest. He climbed the stairs to his rooms above the saloon, the sounds of the town settling into late-night quiet. Somewhere a dog barked, the wind picked up, promising winter's approach. Patrick lit the lamp in his sitting room, glancing at Bridget's most recent letter on his desk. Tomorrow she'd be home. Tomorrow everything would be perfect. The afternoon train released its passengers in a cloud of steam and coal smoke. Bridget Hayes stepped onto the platform with a small trunk and 4 years of education that had changed everything she thought she knew. Copper Ridge looked smaller than she remembered, rougher. She'd been 16 when she left, a girl. Now, at 20, the town's realities struck her with uncomfortable clarity. She walked up the main street toward her father's saloon, passing the scenes that would haunt her. A widow she vaguely recognized struggled with 4 children outside the mercantile, their clothes patched beyond patching. A young woman with a fresh bruise on her cheekbone hurried past, eyes down. 2 businesses she remembered from childhood stood shuttered, their windows empty. And then she saw the Golden Bell. The sign was as grand as her father's letters had promised, but as she stood across the street, a fight exploded through the doors. 2 men crashed into the mud, their curses ugly in the afternoon air. Inside, she could hear shouting, breaking glass. the piano playing through it all as if violence were just another kind of music. This was what her father's money had built. This was his empire. Bridget made herself walk forward. The saloon's interior hit her like a physical blow, thick smoke. The stench of unwashed bodies and spilled whiskey. Men in various stages of intoxication crowding every surface. Her father stood behind the bar, and for a moment she barely recognized him. Older, yes, but more than that comfortable here. At home in this chaos. Bridget. She accepted his embrace stiffly. "Hello, Father." If he noticed her tone, he didn't show it. He ushered her upstairs, talking rapidly about the town, the business, his plans. The rooms above the saloon were neat and well-furnished, her father's care for her evident in every detail of her preserved bedroom. But beneath it all, the saloon's noise vibrated through the floorboards like a sickness in the building's bones. "You must be tired from the journey," Patrick said. "Rest, and tonight we'll celebrate. I've arranged a special dinner." "Father," Bridget cut him off, "I didn't travel 1,000 miles to watch you poison our neighbors." The silence fell hard between them. Patrick's expression shifted from joy to confusion to defensive anger in the space of 3 heartbeats. "Now, Bridget, that's not fair. I run an honest business, honest." She moved to the window. Looking down at the street, "I saw Mrs. McAllister and her children. Her husband drank himself to death in your honest business. I saw Lucy Brennan with a black eye from a husband who spent his wages here instead of feeding his family. I saw—" "You saw what you wanted to see." Patrick's voice hardened. "You've been sheltered in that convent school, reading books about how the world should be. This is the frontier. Bridget, men work hard. They need a place to relax. I provide that. I employ people. I extend credit. I keep order. You profit from suffering. I profit from providing a legal service that men choose to purchase." Patrick's face flushed. "Everything you had that school. Those fine dresses, your books came from this business. You didn't mind the money when it paid for your education." The barb struck home. Bridget felt the sting of complicity, the weight of having benefited from what she now condemned. But that didn't make it right. "You're capable of more than this, boy," she said quietly. "You're intelligent, hard-working, respected. Do something meaningful with your wealth, Father. Build something that doesn't destroy. You don't understand. I understand that you're choosing this. Every day, you choose this." She walked to her bedroom and closed the door. Patrick stood alone in the sitting room as evening fell. His daughter's words hanging in the air, heavier than tobacco smoke, sharper than any whiskey he'd ever poured. For 3 days, Patrick tried to unhear Bridget's accusations. He went about his business with determined normalcy, ordering supplies, managing staff, serving customers. But everything looked different now, as if his daughter had placed a lens over his vision that magnified what he'd trained himself not to see. The widow with 4 children, the wife with the bruised face, the shuttered businesses that couldn't compete with the magnetic pull of alcohol on men's wages. Then came Thursday night, and Thomas Garrett. Patrick had known Thomas since the boy arrived in Copper Ridge 2 years ago, 20 years old, married to a sweet-faced girl named Mary. With 3 small children already, Thomas worked hard in the mines, coming to the saloon maybe twice a month for a beer with friends. A good kid. Responsible. Until Thursday, Thomas came in after his shift with a month's wages in his pocket and something broken in his eyes. Patrick later learned there'd been a cave-in that morning, no one killed, but close enough to touch death. Maybe that explained it. Maybe Thomas just needed to forget what mortality tasted like. He drank steadily through the evening. Patrick served him, as he'd served thousands of men seeking oblivion. When Thomas called for whiskey instead of beer, Patrick poured it. When he bought rounds for strangers, Patrick collected the money. When he fumbled another month's rent onto the bar for another bottle, Patrick provided it by midnight. Thomas Garrett had drunk away everything he'd earned. He stumbled out into the October cold with empty pockets and a debt to consciousness he'd pay with interest come morning. Patrick locked up and went to bed thinking little of it. Men made their choices, but Friday morning brought reality in a form he couldn't rationalize away. Patrick was heading to the mercantile when he saw the Mary Garrett and her 3 children. The oldest, maybe 6, standing outside the store. Mary was speaking quietly to the owner, her voice steady despite what Patrick could see in her face, the exhaustion, the fear, the desperate dignity of someone trying not to break. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Garrett," the mercantile owner was saying, loud enough for Patrick to hear. "Your husband spent his wages. I can't extend more credit." The oldest boy, hollow-eyed and thin, looked up at his mother. "Mama, when will we eat?" Mary Garrett's face didn't change. She didn't cry. She didn't rage. She simply placed her hand on her son's head and said, "We'll manage. Somehow." Patrick stood frozen on the wooden sidewalk, the morning sun bright and merciless. He watched Mary take her children's hands and walk away, her spine straight, her head up, refusing to beg, refusing to blame. Just walking into a future where 3 small children would go hungry because their father had drunk a month's wages in Patrick's saloon. His profit, their starvation. The equation was suddenly, brutally clear. Patrick didn't remember walking back to the Golden Bell. He found himself in his office, staring at last night's receipts. Thomas Garrett's money was there, counted and categorized. Blood money, suffering tallied in neat columns. Bridget's words returned with crushing force. "You profit from suffering." He'd told himself he wasn't responsible for men's choices, but he'd made it easy for Thomas to destroy his family. He'd provided the means, taken the money, sent the man home empty. That night, Patrick stood at his window above the saloon, listening to the familiar sounds below, laughter, arguments, breaking glass, the piano playing through it all. For the first time in 15 years, those sounds didn't represent success. They sounded like weeping. Patrick avoided Bridget for 3 days after seeing the Garrett family. Shame was easier to carry in silence, but on Monday morning, she found him in his office and closed the door behind her with quiet determination. "I have a proposal," she said. Patrick looked up from his ledgers. Surprised, he'd expected more condemnation. "Not a business discussion. I'm listening." Bridget set a folder on his desk. Inside were newspaper clippings, letters, sketches. She'd been busy. "Convert the Golden Bell into a library and community center," she said. "Serve coffee and food instead of whiskey. Create a place for learning, for skill building, for actual community instead of—" She gestured toward the saloon below. Patrick stared at her. "You're asking me to commit financial suicide. I'm asking you to build something that matters. Bridget, I have 15 employees, suppliers, debts. This business supports destruction." She opened the folder, showing him articles about towns that had established public libraries. "Look, crime rates drop, school enrollment increases, economic stability improves, men who spend evenings reading instead of drinking save money, advance in their work, provide better for their families." Patrick scanned the articles, his businessman's mind already calculating the impossibility. The initial investment alone, books, furniture, renovations, and the ongoing costs with no alcohol revenue. I'd be bankrupt in 6 months. Not if it's done right. Bridget pulled out more documents. There are grants from Eastern Philanthropic Societies, donated books from San Francisco, Denver, Cheyenne. The building is already here. You'd need to employ fewer people initially. Yes, but I'd need to fire people who depend on me. They depend on an industry that destroys others. Bridget's voice softened. "I know this is hard, Father. I know it feels impossible, but you asked me once what I learned in school. I learned that education changes lives. The community built on learning instead of oblivion creates something sustainable." A knock interrupted them. Bridget opened the door to reveal a woman Patrick had never seen before, Chinese, perhaps 40, dressed with quiet dignity. "Father, this is Martha Chen. She ran a successful library in San Francisco before—" Bridget hesitated. "Before my husband drank himself to death." Martha finished calmly. She stepped into the office, her gaze direct. "Mrs. Hayes wrote to me about your town. I came to see if what she described was possible. Patrick gestured to chairs. They sat. My husband was a good man, Martha said. Educated, hard-working, but alcohol destroyed him piece by piece. I watched it happen. I couldn't stop it. She paused. After he died, I wanted to build something that might prevent other families from experiencing what we did. I managed a library for 3 years. It worked. Mr. Hayes. Men who spent evenings reading instead of drinking, they became different men. Better fathers. Better providers. And you'd come here, manage this library if I... Patrick couldn't quite say it. Destroy my business. Ruin myself financially. I would, Martha said, if you're willing to try. Patrick looked at the documents spread across his desk. The vision was clear and clearly insane. The Golden Bell transformed into the Copper Ridge Library. Reading tables where card tables stood. Books where whiskey bottles lined the bar. Coffee instead of bourbon. Knowledge instead of oblivion. His savings would vanish. His income would collapse. The town would think him mad. His employees would hate him. Everything he'd built over 15 years would be dismantled. And yet, Mary Garrett's face, her son asking when they'd eat, Thomas Garrett's empty pockets, the widow with 4 children, the shuttered businesses, the violence, the broken families, his ledgers represented suffering. His success was built on others' weakness. 3 months, Patrick heard himself say. A trial period. 3 months. And if it's a disaster, we try something else. Bridget's face transformed with hope. Martha Chen nodded once, her expression unchanged. 3 months, Martha said. We'll build something worth keeping. Patrick wasn't sure if she meant the library or his soul. The dismantling began on a Tuesday morning in late October. Patrick unlocked the Golden Bell's doors for the last time as a saloon and started destroying everything he'd built. Samuel Birch, his head bartender of 12 years, arrived to find Patrick already removing bottles from the shelves. Boss. Samuel's voice carried confusion and fear. What's happening? We're closing, Patrick said. Converting to a library. The silence stretched. Then, you're firing us. I'm keeping you on as long as I can afford it. You'll help with the conversion. After that, Patrick couldn't finish. He had no answer. Samuel left without another word. Patrick heard the news spreading through town within the hour. But there was work to do. Patrick and Bridget labored side by side, creating order from chaos. They boxed hundreds of whiskey bottles, Patrick's inventory. His investment, now just glass and waste. They scrubbed tobacco stains from walls. They removed the polished bar mirror, pried up the brass rail, dismantled the back bar with its ornate shelving. As they worked, they talked. Patrick told stories Bridget had never heard, how he'd arrived in Copper Ridge with 17 doorsteps, how he'd built the first rough saloon with his own hands, the pride of seeing it grow into something substantial. I thought I was building security for you, he said, pausing with a crowbar in hand. Everything was for your future. I know, Bridget said softly. She was on her knees, scrubbing the floor. But Father, you can build security without building on suffering. That's what this is, a different kind of success. Patrick wanted to believe her, but the numbers in his ledgers said otherwise. On Thursday, Martha Chen arrived with the first delivery of books, donated volumes from libraries in San Francisco, Denver, and Cheyenne, crates of them, more than Patrick had imagined. They unpacked together, Martha explaining her vision with quiet authority. The bar shelves will work perfectly for books, she said. We'll organize by category: agriculture, mechanics, history, literature. Men need practical knowledge as much as story. We'll have a children's section here, near the stove, where mothers can bring little ones for story hour. Story hour. In a building that used to host poker games and fistfights, they worked through the week. The whiskey shelves transformed into bookshelves. The card tables became reading tables. The space where drunks had fought became a quiet area for study. The bar mirror's wall now held a bulletin board for community notices. Patrick built new furniture from salvaged lumber, simple chairs, sturdy tables. His hands, which had poured thousands of drinks, now crafted places for learning. The work was different, but familiar. He was still building something, late one night. Bridget came downstairs to find her father sitting at one of the new reading tables, a book open before him. "Father." Patrick looked up, almost embarrassed. "Library Science by," he said. Showing her the title, "Martha lent it to me. I figure if I'm doing this, I should understand how it works. Reading rooms, cataloging systems, patrons' services." He trailed off. "I want to do this right." Bridget kissed his weathered cheek. "You will." After she left, Patrick read until dawn, taking notes like a student. The same determination that had built a successful saloon now focused on building something entirely different. He didn't know if he could make it work, but he'd committed to trying. The Golden Bell Saloon was dying. In its place, something fragile and hopeful was being born. Whether it would survive 3 months remained terrifyingly uncertain. The Copper Ridge Library opened on a gray Monday morning in early November. Martha Chen unlocked the doors at 9 o'clock. Patrick stood beside her, his stomach churning with anxiety. 15 people came that first day, mostly curious families. A few tentative minors. They browsed the books politely, drank coffee Martha provided, and left by early afternoon. Patrick calculated the day's donations against operational costs and felt his savings draining like blood from a wound. By the end of the first week, the backlash began in earnest. Former customers confronted Patrick on the street. Where were they supposed to drink now? The competing saloon across town was too small, too crowded. Why had he destroyed a perfectly good business? The other business owners were worse. The hotel operator, who'd profited from drunk minors needing rooms to sleep it off, turned hostile. The dance hall proprietor, whose business depended on intoxicated men with loose wallets. Benta spread rumors that Patrick had gotten religion and gone soft in the head. "You were one of us," she said coldly when they passed on the street. "Now you're just self-righteous." The employees he'd had to let go spread their resentment through the town. Samuel Birch found work at the competing saloon and refused to speak to Patrick, the cook. The cleaning women, they all needed jobs Patrick could no longer provide. The library's attendance remained modest, 20 patrons one day, 12 the next, some days fewer. The vast space that had once packed with paying customers now sat largely empty, heated at Patrick's expense, staffed at his dwindling resources, serving almost no one. His financial projections showed disaster ahead. At this rate, his savings would last 4 months at most. After that, bankruptcy. Everything lost. The worst came on a Thursday evening. Samuel Birch, drunk from the competing saloon, confronted Patrick outside the library. 12 years I worked for you," Samuel said, his voice loud enough to draw a crowd. 12 years of loyalty, and you threw me away for some foolish dream. You're a traitor. Hayes, a traitor to your own success." Patrick stood silent. What could he say? Samuel was right. Patrick had destroyed a profitable business, ended careers, disrupted the town's social fabric. For what? A library that almost no one used. The crowd watched, waiting for his response. Patrick had none. He simply turned and walked back inside. Samuel's accusations following him. That night, Patrick sat in the empty library, doing calculations he'd done 100 times already. The numbers didn't improve with repetition. He was going bankrupt, pursuing an ideal that the town didn't want. The competing saloon across the street was packed that night, its laughter mocking him through the darkness. Patrick sat surrounded by unread books, heating an empty building, bankrupting himself for a vision that belonged in Bridget's convent school dreams, his, not in the harsh reality of frontier Wyoming. He'd built his fortune from nothing once. Could he survive losing it all? And for what a moral stand the town resented. The November storm hit on a Thursday night. Martha had gone home hours ago. Bridget was visiting the Garrett family, bringing food and checking on the children. Patrick stayed at the library, unable to face the silence of his rooms. Wind hammered the building. Snow drove sideways, turning the street invisible. Patrick walked through the empty library, his footsteps echoing on bare wood floors. The building that had once roared with profitable chaos now sat silent, except for the storm's fury. He could restock the bar, The thought arrived with insidious clarity. Reopen the golden bell. Admit this had been a noble experiment that failed. Return to what worked. What the town wanted. What kept him financially stable. The competing saloon was thriving. Men needed somewhere to drink. If not Patrick's establishment, then someone else's. At least when it was his, he'd run it honestly. Extended credit, kept order. His conscience could live with that. Couldn't it? Patrick sat in the darkness, calculating what it would cost to restock, less than what the library was bleeding from his savings every week. He could rehire Samuel, apologize to the staff, restore the fixtures he'd carefully stored in the basement. The books would go back to their donors. The tables could be sold. The community center dream would die. But at least Patrick wouldn't die bankrupt and mocked. Was he brave enough for transformation, or had Bridget's idealism blinded them both to reality? His father had died poor. That was Patrick's earliest, sharpest memory, his father's pauper burial. The shame of it. The way people had looked at his mother afterward. Patrick had sworn he'd never be poor, never be powerless, never lack the security that money provided. And here he was, choosing poverty, choosing mockery, choosing failure. For what books that no one read, a vision of community that the town rejected, the storm raged. Patrick sat surrounded by the evidence of his folly shelves of books, reading tables, the careful organization Martha had created. All of it beautiful, all of it useless, in the deepest cold of the night. Patrick picked up a book at random. He didn't care what it was, just something to pass the hours until dawn, when he'd have to decide whether to continue this madness or return to sanity. The book fell open to a passage about patience, about seeds planted in fall that lay dormant through winter, invisible and apparently dead, until spring proved the gardener's faith. Patrick read the words, reread them. They proved nothing, changed nothing, but something in him shifted slightly, not hope exactly, but willingness. Willingness to endure uncertainty a little longer, willingness to let the seeds lie buried. The storm passed near dawn. Patrick slept in a chair surrounded by unread books, dreaming of seeds in frozen ground, waiting. The turning came quietly, like spring arriving in increments too small to measure, until suddenly the world was green. It started with Thomas Garrett. Patrick was shelving books on a Tuesday morning in early December when the library door opened. Thomas stood there, his hat in his hands, looking 10 years older than his 22-year. "Mr. Hayes," he said, "I need to learn to read." Patrick set down the books carefully. "You can read." "Thomas, not well enough. The mine's offering supervisor positions, so I say, but you need to read technical manuals, safety regulations. I can manage signs and simple things, but..." He looked at the floor. "I want to be more than I am. For Mary. For my kids." Martha Chen appeared from the back room. "We have literacy classes Tuesday and Thursday evenings," she said. 7 o'clock. Thomas nodded. "I'll be here. I'm sober now. Mr. Hayes, 2 months, not going back." He met Patrick's eyes. "I owe you an apology. That night I drank everything that wasn't your fault. It was mine. But I'm grateful you're not there anymore to make it easy." After Thomas left, Patrick stood very still. It was one seed, one small green shoot in frozen ground, but it was something. That Thursday, Thomas returned with 2 other minors. By the following week, 6 men sat at the reading tables, laboriously working through basic texts, Martha moving between them with patient instruction. Mary Garrett brought her children for the story hour Bridget had organized. She thanked Patrick quietly, her dignity intact but her gratitude real. The town's school teacher, Miss Adelaide Ross, heard about the literacy classes and volunteered to teach trade skills on Saturday mornings, basic mathematics for men wanting to advance, bookkeeping for those hoping to start businesses. Women who had never entered the Golden Bell during its saloon days began attending afternoon reading circles. They gathered to discuss novels, to practice their own literacy, to escape their isolation for a few hours. The change was gradual, almost invisible day by day. But by mid-December, the library had regular patrons, not crowds, not the packed chaos of the saloon days, but steady, purposeful attendance, And then came the Saturday evening that changed everything. Patrick arrived at 6 to help Martha close up, but the library was full. Not rowdy full like the saloon had been, but genuinely, productively full. Every reading table occupied, men studying technical manuals, women sharing books, children reading to their parents. Patrick stood in the doorway, watching. At one table, a young boy, maybe 8, read haltingly to his father, who followed along with a calloused finger on the page. The man couldn't read himself, but his son was teaching him. At another table, 2 miners discussed an article about new safety techniques in the Denver mines. Their conversation serious and engaged. Near the stove, Martha Chen helped a widow named Sarah fill out a legal document about her late husband's mining claim literacy, giving her power to protect herself. The reading circle had expanded to include a dozen women, their voices low but animated as they discussed a novel. Patrick watched it all, this quiet, purposeful gathering. No violence, no waste, no suffering. Just people building themselves up instead of tearing themselves down. The success metric had changed. He wasn't counting coins anymore. He was counting the young father learning to read with his son, the miners researching how to be safer at their work, the widow protecting her claim, the community forming around knowledge instead of oblivion. Patrick Hayes had built many things in his life. This was the first that built others back. 6 months after closing the Golden Bell Saloon, Patrick stood in the same building at evening's end, watching lanterns being lit, men gathering, but everything had changed. Where drunk cowboys once shouted, miners now discussed ideas in quiet voices. Where fights had erupted, children now gathered for evening story hour. Where money had changed hands for poison, knowledge changed hands for free. Patrick's financial situation remained precarious. The library ran on donations and his dwindling savings. Some months were desperate, requiring him to defer paying himself to keep Martha's salary stable and the building heated. The competing saloon across town thrived, its prosperity a constant reminder of the wealth Patrick had voluntarily abandoned. Some in town still resented him. Samuel Birch crossed the street rather than speak to him. A few business owners remained hostile, their profits diminished by the absence of drunk customers. But the metrics that mattered had shifted entirely. Violence in Copper Ridge had dropped 40%, the sheriff's own report. School enrollment had increased, with more families staying in town rather than drifting to the next mining camp. The library hosted 60 regular patrons weekly, many attending multiple times. Thomas Garrett had been promoted to shift supervisor at the mine. His literacy opening doors his labor alone never could. He and Mary had stabilized their family. Their children no longer went hungry. The young boy who'd asked his mother when they'd eat now read above his grade level. Miss Adelaide Ross's trade skill workshops had led to 3 new businesses in town, men who'd learned enough bookkeeping and planning to start modest enterprises. The reading circle women had formed a civic improvement committee. They'd successfully lobbied for a new school building. Patrick's role had transformed. He wasn't an owner anymore, wasn't building an empire. He was a steward, a caretaker of something larger than profit. His pride now came from helping Martha order new books, from seeing men advance in their work because of skills learned at these tables, from watching a community form around learning instead of destruction. Bridget worked alongside Martha full-time now, the 2 women forming the library's heart. Patrick had gained a strange family, his daughter, this quiet widow from San Francisco, and himself, the reformed saloon keeper. On this particular evening in late April, as spring finally broke winter's grip, Patrick surveyed his domain one last time before closing. The reading tables were full. The children's section had a dozen young ones listening to Bridget read. Martha helped a miner's wife with a letter to family back east. The scene looked nothing like the profitable chaos of the Golden Bell's glory days. It was quieter, gentler, far less lucrative, and infinitely more valuable. Patrick locked the doors at 9 o'clock, the library patrons dispersing into the spring evening. He stood on the wooden sidewalk, looking at the building that had been his prison and was now his freedom. Across the street, the competing saloons' lights blazed, laughter spilled into the nightmen drinking their wages, forgetting their troubles temporarily, perpetuating the cycle Patrick knew too well. But here, in this building, men had learned to read, children had discovered stories, women had found community, A town had begun transforming itself through knowledge instead of oblivion. Patrick had lost his fortune. He'd gained something harder to quantify, the peace of knowing his life's work built others up instead of tearing them down. The satisfaction of legacy measured in changed lives instead of profit margins. His daughter joined him on the sidewalk, slipping her arm through his. "Good evening?" she asked. "Very good," Patrick said. They walked together through Copper Ridge's spring evening, past familiar buildings, under stars emerging in the darkening sky. Patrick's empire was gone. In its place stood something smaller, more fragile, infinitely more meaningful. He'd finally learned what wealth truly meant. Behind them, the Copper Ridge Library stood solid against the night, its windows dark, but its purpose burning steady. Seeds planted in faith, growing in patience, bearing fruit in time. Outside, the first real warmth of spring gentled the mountain air. The smell of mud and growing things replaced winter's harshness. New grass pushed through old snow, covering the tracks of what had been, making the world new again. Patrick Hayes breathed deeply and knew he'd finally built something worth keeping.